Thank you, Tara. Thanks for being here. Thanks to Macomb Community College for having us. Let's jump right in to what I think is going to be a spirited conversation. My first question is a very fundamental one, right? We hear in politics today, words get tossed around: justice, rule of law. And they often get thrown around with little to no understanding or definition. And I think due process can fall into that category. So in simple terms, layman's terms, what is due process? Let's start with Keith.
I think when I think of due process, I think of everybody getting a fair shake. There's often so much more to this story than what we know. And that doesn't just apply to us. It applies to a law enforcement officer who comes upon a scene of a purported crime. There's a lot of details that are unknown to that person. It applies to the prosecutor who's trying to prosecute that crime. It applies to the attorneys involved. All of us have elements of that we don't know. And so to me, when I think due process, I think of everyone getting a fair shake to get the details, to get the information that's necessary to process the information, and not have anyone presumed to be guilty or innocent. Well, I guess we prefer they be presumed to be innocent until they're proven guilty. Let me rephrase that. We do presume that they're innocent, but we don't want a presumption of guilt without knowing all of the facts. And so due process is your chance, our chance, anyone who's accused of something to have that chance to be heard and to have the whole story come out before there are assumptions made.
Right? I like that. That sounds good. Fundamental fairness. And as a minister of justice, that's what they call the prosecutor, we want to see that justice is equally distributed, equal fairness. Doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, the color of your skin, or what religion you practice. It's a way to be heard. Fundamental fairness means an opportunity to be heard and to go ahead and have that presumption of innocence. Because our hallmark of the system that we all live under is a justice system. A system that's just. So due process has to be just. And at the end of the day, when you wake up in the morning, you want to be heard, but you want to be treated fairly. And you want to be able to assert your defenses without already having the presumption of guilt.
I think I would just add, in the concept of fairness, due process is supposed to serve as the individual's checks and balances on their own government, in your ability to defend yourself and your right to be presumed innocent. It's a defense against the government coming and taking your property and, most importantly, your liberty from you without proving first that you've done something wrong, or at least by the letter of the laws. As I'm sure we'll get to later, there are civil asset forfeiture laws that do, in fact, allow them to take your property without you doing something criminal. But if we look back at the history of due process, that has always been its purpose. One of the earliest concepts of due process comes from the Magna Carta. It's a very, very long history that even predates our country, but I think we've expanded on it and we've made it better as Americans. And so I would just say that I'm glad that there are so many people here to discuss this, because I think there's a big difference between a criminal justice advocate or someone who's interested in the criminal justice system who happens to be a conservative, and a conservative who happens to wake up one day and say, wait a minute, I don't think justice is being delivered adequately in this country. And if we can start with due process and make sure that everyone is getting that fair shake, I think it makes everything else easier, and I think all of your voices are particularly valuable in making sure that we abide by that.
So in today's world, concepts like this obviously important. Fundamental to our system of government. Can you point out to our audience some examples of where you think today due process is not being, where there's a lack of due process?
Do we just chime in?
Sure. Yeah, this is a free-for-all, Pete.
Okay.
You're used to that.
So in the process of arrest, the first critical stage, one has a right to be heard as far as bail is concerned. And sometimes the individuals that are put on the bench by way of appointment and or elections, because they have consequences, don't always realize that there's enough information before they set a bail. And some of these examples that I'm going to give you are, what is the right thing to do? It's supposed to be to protect the people that are out there in our community, but it's also to be fundamentally fair and balance the risk of harm to the community versus the individual's freedoms. The most egregious freedom to take away is somebody's liberty. And when you take away liberty, you've taken away their life. So there is no opportunity to be heard. So in the criminal justice system, which I've been a part of for over 40 years, from the fact that we have to say that elections and or appointees matter is a very severe thing. And recently, where do I see due process is not being had? You know, that was the hallmark of what we learned in law school. Your 14th Amendment was your sacred amendment. And that sacred amendment meant everybody had a right to be heard. And everybody had to be treated fairly in a court of law. Because that's the system we all live under. And if not, then we have no freedoms. We're a dictatorship. So from the moment we get into the arena called our court system, either civilly or criminally, you have to be able to at least get your day in court. And we're not seeing that, and we're not seeing that the individuals in the court sometimes are weaponized to go against the very basic freedoms in which we live under.
It was Chief Justice Rehnquist who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, who in an opinion that had much to do with bail said liberty is the norm and detention should be a very limited exception to that. And I think Pete made a really good point early on in his remarks here about community safety and how bail is not being applied equally, largely because people who are appointed or elected are worried that something's going to happen, and so they err on the side of caution a little bit too often, and they're not actually taking data and evidence about what results in a safe community into consideration. And so what happens is that people who don't have money are being detained more than people who do have money. Because if you're able to post that $5,000 bond, no big deal. You're back out with your family in no time. If you're not able to, you're going to sit behind bars. You're probably going to lose your job, and bad things happen. And so I think what we can really learn from that, though, is where we lose our track on due process is when we can't agree what the point of justice is. What is the goal of providing justice? I like Pete's answer there, community safety, because when it comes down to it, I want myself and my kids to be safe so that we can go out and pursue our potential in our communities. That's what being American is all about to me. But there's a fundamental disagreement about what justice really is, and we're starting to see it applied to people unfairly who we assume are guilty. We are starting to see it applied to groups of people who we simply don't like because they disagree with us, and we're seeing it applied to people who have maybe high profiles, who then get vilified, and they ultimately have a trial by the public before they even get into the courtroom. And when we lose that North Star of what justice really means, people are deprived of due process very quickly.
I don't really think that there's a lot to add to what they've said here. They've really covered, I think, the subject well, but we need only look in the news today and look around us at everything that's coming at us. There's a deluge of information about lack of due process. And you can pick your subject. You can pick which side of the aisle you want to pick it on. It goes both on the left and the right. There's been this continual lack of due process. Probably one of the ones that was most glaring to me in recent years would be the folks from January 6th who sat for so long without even getting a hearing. That's a lack of due process. You have a right to have a hearing. And regardless of how anyone feels about what happened on that day, those people deserve the same due process as everyone else. And so I think that was a glaring example that we all saw in the news. There are people still sitting there who haven't had their due process rights followed. And I think, I don't need to add to what they've said other than to say, watch the news and you'll see where due process is lacking.
Political exertion has created a lot of this problem. Political exertion. Remember what I'm saying. It's the fact that the public has put a pressure on the elected officials to go ahead and do the wrong thing because they believe in more of social media and or the papers, televisions, than actually understanding. And remember this tonight. Most people are not as smart as you think they are. and they believe more through social media and truly carry out a loud voice and exert that pressure on elected officials. To the point that Diana made is this: those that have, I've always realized after 40 years in the criminal justice system, get justice. Those that have not do not receive justice because their voice is never heard. They don't have that same ability to buy justice with a mouthpiece. You have to give somebody a lawyer. It doesn't say they have to be skilled. It doesn't have to say they're knowledgeable. And as a minister of justice, somebody who is looking over the process to make sure it's fundamentally fair for everyone. Because if we ruin the system, the actual hallmark we live under, nobody is going to take place in society to even think that the justice system is going to give them justice. So we have to show that this justice system, regardless of the influence and political pressure, give them their day in court, give them a chance to be heard, and be a champion for those that have less than we do.
So if there are instances or patterns where due process is not being provided, or where that fundamental fairness does not seem to be applied, where's the accountability for that? Who can, if members of our audience think that government isn't giving, isn't providing the right amount of due process to folks, who do they turn to hold them accountable? Because it's not, the executive, or is it? Is it the legislature? Is it the judicial branch, many of whom are appointed rather than elected? Who do we turn to for accountability if due process is not given its due?
That's a great question, Dave. Here's what I see. The MIDC, the Michigan Indigent Defense Council, was formed as a result of undue influence and pressure by society that said, we are not getting the representation for the indigent in this society, and we're living in the 21st century. So they went ahead and funded it with about $138 million. That was tax dollars. So we're giving money to the ones that are the accused. And years ago, when I was practicing and then represented the accused, I would ask in the indigents, Judge, I'd like to get a couple bucks to get an expert. Motion denied, we don't have the money. Judge, I'd like to get a couple bucks to get an investigator. The neighborhood that this crime occurred in, you got to get there when they, turn the lights on about 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, and I don't have time. I'm going to sleep so I can go to court the next day. Motion denied, no money for the investigator. So if the other side, the taxpayers' dollars on the prosecutor's side, are buying investigators and buying experts in the field, who am I to go against an expert that I don't have that ability and skill level? Who am I that I never had the knowledge to take on an expert? And you can see that due process was not there. And they bring them shackled in chains into the courtroom. During my tenure in the courtroom, we had then draped the front of the table that they sit at just to give a fair advantage, because you're presuming this person's guilty the way they bring them in. And at the end of the day, how fair is a trial when you never had an investigator go into the neighborhood and or interview witnesses and or fed out the evidence, or better yet, an expert that's going to testify how guilty this individual is because they're working for the prosecutor? Now think about it. Would you want to be sitting as an indigent person? Today, at least the MIDC has said, let's make it fair. Let's give some money so that there is justice within those courtrooms. Because otherwise, you're filling jails with innocent people some days. So think about it. Now you can get the individuals to go out and investigate and get the experts that you need to make the system in balance. Remember, that lady sits up there with that blindfold every day. Let's not have it out of balance from the beginning.
My grandpa used to say that if I didn't vote, I wasn't allowed to complain. He didn't use that word, but that was what he meant. And it was something that, was very targeted at voting, right? Just the way he said it. If you don't vote, you don't get to complain. But in our family, it was deeper than that, right? My grandma in her high school yearbook said that, under her picture in her high school yearbook, her senior year, said she was peeved with Mr. Hayden in his government classes. I come by this work very naturally from a genetic standpoint. And I think that you do have to vote before you can complain, and so you do hold elected officials accountable at the voting box, but you also have to go a little bit deeper than that. You can't stop there because, as you pointed out, some people are appointed, and also you are going to have to engage with your community groups who are tracking this stuff, because they have people who are paid to stay on top of the data and the transparency that is available, and to alert you when the data is not being collected and things are not being tracked at the government level the way they should. And so I think it's each person's job to hold the system accountable at every point. Pete mentioned that, you know, when you get a court-appointed lawyer because you can't afford one, it doesn't say that they have to be skilled or that they have to know what they're doing, or, you know, that anyone else would ever choose them if they did have money. But it also doesn't say that necessarily that they can't have overloaded cases. There have been multiple instances in the last year where it comes out in the news that some of these lawyers who are being appointed have so many cases on their plate they can't possibly even look at them, let alone actually defend the person. And so I think, one, you need to engage with the community groups who are available. I am not from Macomb County. I'm so sorry. I'm from a different part of Michigan.
Make Macomb your home.
I've considered it. But I'm sure Pete does know the organizations that you could engage with, and so you could get that information from his office or him after the thing. But engage with those groups. Find out what data and transparency is not being tracked at the state level. Advocate for it. We should know what every single court-appointed lawyer has on their caseload all of the time. We should know how much they're being paid. We should know if one county is getting more money than the other and they're not having that number of cases that need to be tried. We should know in law enforcement who's being arrested, what they're being arrested for, how long they're being detained, if they're being detained. In every single community, that information should be available. Law enforcement is the only government program that conservatives put the cookies in the cookie jar and they slide it across the table and they say, good luck. We don't want to hear anything else. Because there are people, right? We support law enforcement, and we should, but support doesn't mean turning a blind eye and saying do whatever you want with the tax dollars. It means funding them well because they need the resources to keep us safe, and then also saying, okay, how's it going? How can we make this better together? And so you have to do that at every point in the system, right down to the judges, the prosecutors, and the legislators, certainly.
So maybe there's an oversight role for legislative bodies to come in and ask those kinds of questions. Maybe we can demand a bit more from our legislators to engage in that function, which they seem to like to do when it's flashy, but maybe not with those kinds of issues. Keith, you got anything to add to that?
I would just say, to be fair, there are a lot of, this highlights the importance of being here tonight, because there are a lot of organizations, like Diana said, that do track this information, but we have this tendency to discount organizations who may have a different political bent than we do. I think only back to a few years ago, I live over on the other side of the state, and there was a farmer in Grand Rapids area who was putting up trailers on his property, semi-trailers, and he would post signs on the side of the semi-trailer. And the community came after him and said, these are billboards, and this is not permitted. We don't permit billboards. He said, they're not billboards. They're semi-trailers. They're parked in my field. You can see them from the highway. And a conservative law firm that represents people for free came in to represent him and said, we're going to take your case and we're going to fight this so you can keep your trailers. And I sat in the courtroom to listen to this case because I happened to go to church with this farmer. And I was shocked when the ACLU of Michigan stood up and fought for that farmer's right to put up his anti-Obama signs on his trailer. I never expected it because I have a personal opinion about the ACLU and who I think they are, right? And so we have these organizations that are out there that are sharing information, and some of the information is really good, but we tend to discount voices if they're not from an organization we're either familiar with or we believe has the same political bent we do. And so when I see all of you here tonight, you're participating in the process by coming here to become educated tonight. And by being part of this process, you're learning, and you're learning from a group of people who you feel comfortable with. At least I hope you do. And you're getting information from sources that you consider credible. We have to be a little bit more open to looking at information that we can get that comes from sources we may not know as much about because it's available out there. We just have to be willing to search it and find out the accuracy of it.
Dave, to Keith's point, and everybody, if the ACLU wasn't there to participate in his legal defense, the government wins at all costs and every time. Because people don't want to sometimes go ahead and spend the money, spend the time, as well as go through the headache of trying to defend their liberties by way of their rights, so they move the trailers out. But here in this case, it was odd to see that maybe your political bent wasn't with the ACLU, but look what they did. They ensured his civil liberties as well as his First Amendment right to speech. And they're making a point, not so that today this gets settled, but for the future, you just can't go ahead and tell me what to do on my own property. I have rights. So thanks for that story. That's a good one.
Who won the case?
They did. He won the case. His trailers are still up today, actually.
The ACLU is currently trying, is party to a case with the Supreme Court where they've joined forces with the NRA. They joined forces with Americans for Prosperity and a very long list of other organizations on both sides of the aisle to protect Americans' rights to use their money to influence legislation through C4s without being disclosed. And they won that in front of the Supreme Court. On the foundational level of freedom of speech, you'll find that people on both sides of the aisles tend to agree most of the time once they've thought it through.
You all are mind readers. Speaking of the ACLU and NRA, there are any number of groups that are out there that fight every day, tooth and nail, in a very public way, with all kinds of backing for First Amendment rights, whether it's speech, religion, press, assembly, right to petition government for redress of grievances, certainly the Second Amendment. Has the Due Process Amendment, has the Due Process Clause become an orphan? And if so, why? Why is it play second fiddle to some of these other ones? When it, as you've said, is a fundamental element of our democratic system.
I think it goes back to the same thing we were just talking about. It's our circles. And when I think about my circle, up until 5 or 6 years ago when I started working on some of these issues, I went to church every Sunday, most of the time twice on Sunday. My kids went to Christian school. I lived in this very sheltered, law-abiding, I thought, community. You come to find out we all commit about 4 or 5 crimes a day. We just don't know it. But we thought we were a law-abiding community. And so these issues didn't affect my household. They didn't affect me. They didn't affect my cousins, my aunts and uncles, my brothers and sisters, my grandparents. My circle was not impacted by this issue. And I would sit and I'd listen on the news as other people would complain about not receiving their rights, not having their due process rights followed. And I would just sit there with this mindset of, you do the crime, you do the time, right? I just thought, oh, they're all criminals, and if they didn't do something wrong, this and that, they wouldn't be in this situation. And then you dig in a little. And then you look at January 6th. And then you look at any one of the issues we've all looked at over the last 4 or 5 years. And you suddenly realize there are people who are being charged who didn't do the crime. And suddenly, it's impacting our circles. It's no longer somebody else's problem that doesn't affect me. And so I think it's an orphan because it didn't impact us. It didn't impact people we knew. We didn't have somebody we knew within our own personal circle who had an experience with us. And all of a sudden, now it does. And when that happens, suddenly we stand up and take notice and go, why hasn't anybody done anything about this? Well, they have. They've been trying to. We've just been sitting on the sidelines, not really paying attention. And I think now we're finally starting to wake up. And that's the goal of this coalition as well, is to try to help us to wake up even more, to realize that this has become an orphan.
There was some polling done in Utah actually several years ago where it was on bail, and it was only like 14%, if I remember correctly. It's been a few years now, but I think it was right around 14% of Utahns had actually had any sort of contact with the bail system. And when they first polled, they asked first, do you think that the system is fair? And it was something around 76%. It was like 3/4 thought that the system was fair. Then they said, do you have any experience with it? Only 14% actually had experience with the system. And half of those had posted bail for an immediate family member. And so then they went on and they explained how the system worked in very clear and very nonpartisan terms. And then they asked again, do you think the system is fair? And I think it was 28% was the difference between the percentage that thought it was fair to begin with and the percentage that thought it was fair afterwards. To Keith's point, people just don't know. And to be fair to people, we live in a time when we are being absolutely inundated with information constantly. Whether you want to or not, you cannot get away from it. And increasingly, you can't control what information you're even getting. And so to people's credit, it's really hard to keep up. But now that you're here and you've heard about it, you go home and you tell a neighbor. Instead of them just getting whatever ad they got on Facebook that day, tell them about something that actually matters in their community.
The senselessness that is learned in school today. Now, shut your cell phones off for a minute, because none of us that are here had cell phones back in school. None of us had computers. Some of us did. Most of us didn't. So we didn't have those distractions and the noise on the outside. What we had was reality. We had teachers that would literally be able to teach without these interruptions and distractions. We had teachers that taught government classes about what our three branches of co-equal exist and how they are supposed to balance and check on each other to keep it honest. That's all gone, guys. And the reason is maybe their views, their skewed views of how the world is, may be influencing our own children. And I don't want to talk about the educational processing, but teachers have got enough to deal with when they're having these issues, let alone trying to teach it in a government that I came up with, which was a fair, just government of protection. See, government was put into place in this Constitution, and our drafters were talking about things aren't perfect. And that's why we can amend this document by way of amendments. But we're not going to go ahead and look at this document and shred it, because that's been the hallmark of how we live. And I learned it, and I thought I understood it, but when I got to the Capitol, they showed me a different way about how government's really working. And when I sat there in the legislature, both House and Senate, and saw a bill make it to the governor's desk and she vetoes it, I looked at the reasons why it was vetoed. Sometimes it becomes political. Sometimes it becomes an angst against whatever member she may feel she doesn't like. But I do know one thing. I went right back at it and took a stab again, because the government I believed in said, I have to have justice somewhere. And either I'm going to continue to climb, or I'm going to be beaten by the executive branch. We are coexisting. We're supposed to have co-equal powers that are shared, and the executive can veto it. It can come back to the 2/3 House majority and Senate and pass. I want those children to learn the law as well as their government the way we all did. That's their hallmark, getting back to basics, putting the foundation back in place. I hope we can get there, because if we can't, they're learning a government that doesn't exist. And the other thing is this. I see a justice system of a Ferris wheel. I see a justice system that has changed over the last 40 years, that is hard on crime, soft on crime, whatever that landing spot is. We've developed all of these different courts to treat the symptoms of what a prisoner, or the recidivism rate, which means continuous, that Ferris wheel effect. Some get off and go to their own path. Some stay on their whole lifetime. And I start to look at the symptoms, and I look at 76% of our prisoners in this state. And we don't have a lot of prisons. We've closed 3 of them over the last 7 years, and found alternative plans than just spending money to lock people up. I don't have a problem locking up somebody who's a threat to my family or my community. But if they're drug addicts, they're drunks, and they have pill popping problems, that is not solving any problem ever. It's just costing us a lot of money. So we have these specialty courts. And to get to the point of where we are today, we've changed that system. We learned during COVID that we let all these people out as they were vetted. We had no incidents here in Macomb County, not one. But I sure spend a lot of money on my taxes to run a jail, to run a prison. And I wonder sometimes who benefits? Not the people. And I really do believe that justice lies in the eyes of the victims, because what justice looks like to them, you give it to them. And I ask every victim that lost a loved one or has been brutally beat up, what does justice look like you? Because you're the one I'm supposed to satisfy. You have the rights at this point, what you believe justice is. And it comes in different forms and in different punishments. So remember, we do have standing. Don't give that up. Teach your grandchildren and your children, when you don't like what's going on, don't let them shut down your speech. That's the worst thing that can happen. You have a right in this world, under our freedoms, to articulate what means something to you. And if you can't, go ahead and go represent. Because that's what's happened to me. I looked at my own children and I said, I have a duty to stand, and I have a duty to show them that I'm going to take the gun and do the charge. Otherwise, I've ruined their lives that are going to come, and my grandchildren to boot. So it's important that we stand up, we articulate, and we're knocked down constantly by newspapers, false stories, and lastly, social media influences. And how do you overcome that? That's the real question tonight.
A little moderator's privilege here. Pete, you won't speak against the education system, but since I'm part of it, I will.
No objection, Your Honor.
The lack of plain and simple civics education that young people get is terrible. I think I told Pete this once, but I gave I had first day of class, Intro to American Politics, and I gave all my students, 80 or so of them, the citizenship test. Multiple choice, hand-picked, easy questions, 40% of them failed. Wouldn't have become citizens. 6 out of 10. D minus, raise it to an acceptable level, half of them wouldn't have passed, right? It's terrible. And they can go through universities, colleges, and not have to learn those same sorts of things. I think it's time for a re-examination of what we teach our kids. But I digress. We've talked about, Pete, you've mentioned 3 co-equal branches of government. Yes. Is there a case to make that the judicial branch is the most important? I mean, there's an argument that the framers in the Constitution put Congress in Article 1, the legislative branch, first for a reason. Judicial branch comes third. But is there an argument to be made that, given some of the things we've talked about, fairness, making sure people are protected and their rights and liberties are protected, that it's the most important branch?
The judges have the last word. They do. At the time of sentencing, it's an exclusive purview of the judge to impose the sentence. Not the prosecution, not the police, not the governor or the executive branch, as well as not the legislature. It is the judiciary. But here's the difference. You sent lawmakers, citizens' representatives, up to Lansing to do a job. That job was to hear your voice and bring that articulable law to be put on the books that'll help your community. They went and made the law. It's a total waste of money to send a lawmaker to Lansing that makes a law that's never going to get enforced. Or better yet, never going to be followed by our judges. Think of it. The lawmakers got it passed, put it on the books. And now we have to go ahead and make sure that that law is enforced. Because that's what the people and the legislature as a team put through, and the executive signed. Bottom line is, if the judges aren't going to enforce the law, then what good was the lawmaker going to Lansing? And on top of it, if the prosecution, who takes an oath of office, says, I solemnly swear to support the Constitution and uphold the laws of the state of Michigan. You don't pick and choose which one you want to uphold. They're on the books, and until they've been repealed, they're part of our origin. And if Dave says tonight as the moderator, Professor Dulio, does the judiciary have that much power at the end? The balance and the check is it in line with what the crime was? And there's another check to go to the Court of Appeals if the sentence doesn't fit the crime. That's all we have. So if you want to talk about exclusivity, the judiciary branch has the last word, but the appellate court can overturn that word. That's the only recourse we have, Dave.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's designed as well as it can be, keeping in mind that everything we do is run by humans. We can't afford endless appeals, and yet we do see cases where someone who's been accused of something and then convicted runs out of appeals or makes a technical mistake that wastes the only appeal they have left, and they end up sitting in prison for a very long time, sometimes life. But that is how it happens when your systems are run by humans. But I do think it's very important that the judiciary be made up of people who are thoughtful in the job that they do. I personally would not want to do that job. You're holding someone's life essentially in your hands every time you make a decision. I heard someone recently, I sat on another panel with a former U.S. prosecutor and federal level, and he said one of his early mentors in life had said to him, we argue a lot about how long sentences should be, and this judge that was a mentor was known as a very tough judge, but often gave out very short sentences. And he said, we do all of this arguing about how tough we should be on crime and how long somebody should be in prison. I think what we forget is how long 2 years is in prison. Mm-hmm. And so I think those are the types of judges that we need, and particularly because they are the last word.
Keith?
I don't know that there's really anything that needs to be added to that. And
Okay.
I'd just as soon leave time for some of the questions.
Yeah, sure. And let's get to some audience questions. But the system is run by humans. Maybe we'll just turn it over to AI and everything will be fine.
You think?
You have to remember that AI is informed by humans.
The code is written by people, right?
Excuse me. The FBI office is right across the street.
It's true.
Really, I love this question. It is so bang on. So, red flag laws. Vulnerability of people to be caught up in that, right? What kind of due process concerns do we have around red flag laws and the right to bear arms?
In short, a taking without an opportunity to be heard. Somebody falsely accused and they come and take your weapons. Where have they had their day in court before they did a taking? I want to be very clear. I literally went to Lansing to fight the civil asset forfeiture law because I saw that we had a civil process, which was the taking of property, and a criminal process, which is denying liberty, which is something that has a higher standard of burden of proof. How can you take somebody's property, sell it off within 21 days if you never even had your day in court to be convicted of a crime? It didn't make sense. It was a money grab for most cities, townships, and villages and counties. And at the end, they did not succeed. I was the only one with one cop that said, you're doing the wrong thing. At least give them an opportunity to be heard before you start to sell their property. If you want to take it because you believe it's an instrumentality of a crime or was garnered by funds of a crime, that's one thing. But don't sell it off until you've actually found them guilty by way of a jury of their peers, because you've given away then their property rights without a due process. And to that point, we should always understand that our system should give people a right to speak and not just be silenced and do the wrong thing. So what you're saying is true. I mean, do we have a right to speak in court when the judge says, no more talking?
Red flag laws, anybody else? Thoughts on that?
I think at the heart of the concerns with red flag laws are the same concerns that we see around other registries and things that all state governments keep. In Michigan, a few years back, we reformed, and by the way, it was a broad bipartisan group. To throw back to the ACLU comment, the ACLU was on board with this reform too, and I passed it while I worked at Americans for Prosperity. There was a Child Protection Services, CPS registry in the state of Michigan that if anyone called CPS on you, you were put onto the registry. There was no way for you to get your name off from it. It was a mind-blowing, and I won't shop around false statistics. It's been a few years now, so I don't remember exactly how many it was, but it was a mind-blowing number of Michiganders who were on this registry. And what would happen when you got on the registry, they wouldn't tell you why, who called, what the complaint was that put you there. There was no way for you to appeal to get your name off. And what we were having was grandparents and parents who didn't know why they were even on this list, but they were losing out the ability to volunteer at field trips. There's a bunch of other adults there, and you can't even accompany your child. You couldn't volunteer for 4-H. You might not be able to volunteer at your church VBS because it would show up on a background check and it would say that you were unsafe to be around children, even though you'd never been convicted of a crime and had no idea that there was even a complaint against you in some cases. And so I think it's the same concerns. Anytime we're going to take away somebody's rights, whether that's their liberty or any of the other enumerated rights that we have as Americans, there needs to be a way for that person to appeal. They need to have access to the facts of their case. They need to have a clear layout of how that they can take that path forward to appeal. And they need to, Pete's point earlier, to have their opportunity to be heard.
Doesn't that violate the confrontation clause? You just put somebody on a registry. They didn't even get a chance to confront their accused as to the facts and circumstances surrounding it. And for the rest of their life, they're going to sit there and be forever damned because somebody made an allegation.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of this stuff comes back to politicization of all of these things. So many times we're okay with something when it's done by our side, and we're against it when it's the other side. And we even see that in some of the efforts in Lansing to fix some of these laws. We would see a group of conservative lawmakers step forward and jump on board with a bill to improve this system. And one or two lawmakers would jump up and stand in the way and be like, but I stand with law enforcement. And then other people would get rallied up and they'd go, yeah, me too, me too. And in reality, they weren't standing with law enforcement. They were actually standing against law enforcement in a lot of ways. But people would take a side because it's our side versus their side. And so I think when we look at things like red flag laws, suddenly we become concerned. Well, I'm a little concerned when it's the other side doing it, but when it's my side doing it, maybe it's not so bad. I think we've got to get away from politicizing our justice system and get down to the brass tacks. And that's why you're seeing more and more of these bipartisan coalitions coming together to work on things like bail right now in Michigan. Bail is currently being considered in Michigan. Why? Because there's a problem with the system. I think it was laid out very clearly here. Somebody who has money can get out, somebody who doesn't have money can't. Are they getting the same access to justice? They're not guaranteed the same outcome, but they should have the same access to justice, right? And so we have to get to the point where we're saying these issues transcend our political ideology. They transcend our party affiliation, and they come down to the Constitution and what's right and wrong.
By the way, we don't gain anything just because someone you don't like or that you don't agree with spends more time in jail. Like maybe you get some satisfaction from that if you're a terrible person, but as a community, we gain absolutely nothing. There's very strong data and evidence out there that if somebody spends even 3 days in jail pre-trial, they're more likely to be on welfare later, they're less likely to be paying taxes, and these repercussions happen for years down the road afterwards. It's a very destabilizing event in a person's life to spend time in jail. They are also, if they spend too much time in jail, more likely to commit another crime later on. With juveniles in particular, we see if you lock juveniles up and you put them into facilities with other kids, particularly when you take younger juveniles and put them with older juveniles, you're sending them to crime school. Don't do that. They need help. They don't need to be locked up. And so we don't gain anything. All we gain as taxpayers is less safety and a much bigger tax bill, to Pete's point, at the end of the year, because we're paying for more jails and more prisons and more welfare. Even if the person doesn't commit another crime, they're less likely to be gainfully employed, and so you're supporting them as well.
There are apparently multiple mind readers in the audience out there with some of these questions that are coming in. Let's turn to college campuses and a two-part question. One is precisely on due process, and again, the other one is moderator's prerogative, and going to ask you about First Amendment. But on college campuses, what are we doing to protect due process on college campuses? And I imagine this is targeted at accusations around sexual misconduct, sexual assault, right, that changed dramatically during the Obama years, and what processes were in place. But the second part about freedom of speech, about the right to speak on a college campus. That has come up in the news a lot these days, and we see it time after time with speakers that are disinvited or shouted down or that sort of thing. So due process, freedom of speech, college campuses, go.
It's all you, Keith.
Tell me. Well, I think that for all of the negatives that have come with social media has in a lot of ways exposed this problem in ways we didn't see before, because we can find out it's going on immediately. You can be sitting at home 10 states over and find out that something is happening on a college campus. And the first disinfectant is often daylight.
Yeah.
Right. We've got to shine daylight on the problem so that we know where the problem is so that we can fix it. And so if we want to get to the root of these problems, daylight is one of the best things we can have to expose what's going on. I think it's going to take minds that are probably brighter than mine to come up with how we fix these problems. But I think in this instance, the fact that we're getting so much exposure to these problems is a great first step. And the fact that there are people who are taking the time to be in meetings like this tonight to ask those very questions of how do we fix it? Because somebody has to ask the question in order for somebody to come up with an answer, right? So the fact that you're here, the fact that you're asking this question, it's the first step to figuring out the solution to what we do here. And I don't know that I have anything to add to what that solution might be.
I think I'll just go with I can be the classic conservative mom on the panel for a second. When the Operation Gridlock was happening during COVID, my oldest daughter was in college at the time at MSU, and while I agreed with the reason for the protest, I have to be honest, I didn't go to the protest for that reason. Don't give me too much credit. We were actually just really tired of being at home, and I thought, well, that looks like a fun thing to do for the day. So both of my girls and I got in our truck and we went to Operation Gridlock and we, rode around. And while we were sitting there, to Keith's point about social media, my daughter made a TikTok. And however you feel about TikTok, I'll take your comments afterwards. I'll give you an email address I don't check. You can submit them there.
Okay.
No, but her TikTok went viral and it got a lot of attention. And for about 6 weeks afterwards, my oldest daughter got death threats from all of the other college students who thought that she was a terrible person for leaving the house and being locked inside of a vehicle with her mom and sister who she lived with, I guess. I don't know. We were putting people at danger is what they were being told. So I think at the end of the day, though, as much as that is an appalling story, and my younger daughter was very, very upset about it. My older daughter is a little bit more like me. She was like, okay, well, send me more messages, I guess. I'm still going to do what I'm going to do. It wasn't something that required a government response, in my opinion. And I think a lot of these things, don't require a government response. We have to stop thinking about everything in, you know, the old adage of all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. In this case, as her mom, I checked in with both girls, made sure that they were okay, provided them the support that they needed for the messages that were coming in. We took them seriously, but not too seriously, because most of them clearly weren't. And we just moved forward from there. And to this day, both of my girls are very outspoken. They'll tell you exactly what they think. They'll tell me exactly what they think. And I think we need more of that. We need more family engagement around college campuses and free speech in particular, because I raised both of my kids to be able to be ready to be on their own as soon as they were 18, because it was always my goal that they would be able to advocate for themselves. But that doesn't mean that they don't need support just because they're adults. They're now, my oldest is about to get married. She's in her mid-20s, and she still needs my support every day. So to Keith's point, when the sunshine comes out that a college near you is having an issue, if you know a student there, reach out to them and see how that you can support them. Because at the end of the day, what free speech on college campuses is about is our young people refusing to sit down when their voice isn't being heard. And so if you can support them at the family level and at the community level in doing that, then we have a lot fewer issues for the government to go out hammering away at.
No comment. There's nothing to talk about. The rules are set by the colleges. It's funded by the state taxpayers. And if you don't live by the rules, apparently you may not do so good in school.
Even at public institutions, which are government entities, and
They are government entities. That's all they fight about up at the Capitol, is about how much money these colleges are going to get. It's ridiculous. And on top of it, those that are supposed to be learning the process are being stifled from the process. Now, granted, some things are not speech, and some things are hatred, and some things are against the rules. When somebody's burning stuff and destroying stuff, that's not speech. Speech is something that you are allowed to say what you feel and how you feel without being stifled and by being quiet. But when a campus has the control over that student, you lost sight of what they're there for. They're supposed to be somebody, not the person you want them to be.
changing directions. Qualified immunity.
Why, Dave?
Did you?
It's on the,
Why?
We got a question.
Yeah?
Who oversees and who provides oversight?
So Vin Johnson went on the Oxford shooting, and you know, it's out there. He sued on behalf of a few of the families that lost loved ones. And the judge threw it out and said it's qualified immunity. You have no basis. But yet I had counselors in there, I had therapists in there, I had all these school individuals there. If you're putting them in there and they're not being held accountable for the very basic duty that they're purposed in that educational process, why do you have qualified immunity if you can't even get the question to get an answer? You want to talk about sunshine? Best way to sow that sunshine is let them speak. Let them tell what their story is. The insurance policies, though, are going to be paid by us, which means ultimately we're going to spend more money out of our pockets. But there's got to be some accountability within these schools that we fund as taxpayers. And I don't know what that is, but the discussion is open now. And whether the law changes and how it changes and whether there's going to be insulation for those that are on these school campuses and or high school, the jury's still out on it, guys. I'm not going to put my kid into a school that I know is going to have problems. None of us would. But if a problem arises and they can just scoot away and it's our money that's going into the school to keep the school going, where's our voice?
It's never a dull night when you do a panel with Pete Lucido.
Yeah, that's right.
Keith can attest to the fact that I am most excited about and will only really work on any issues where there's a very big opponent for me to try to take down, because it's what makes me happy. And therefore, I love this room and these difficult questions, but even I won't take on qualified immunity right now.
Nope, pass. Okay, so it's after 8. I know we're, so I'm going to ask one final question and take it back to sort of where we started, right? So the framers, the Constitution. Are we today, as a country, a democracy, are we meeting what the framers wanted when it comes to protecting liberty, protecting rights with due process in our justice system?
I don't know that I think we've ever met it from day one. I mean, it was always a bold idea, right? And there was always a recognition that it was going to be tough to achieve what they set out to achieve, and that we were never going to do it perfectly. As was stated, there's a reason why our laws are open to being changed and processes are open to being changed. I think our awareness of some of these problems is greater today than it has been maybe at any time in the past. As people are hyper vigilant about their rights and their freedoms, sometimes for the wrong reasons, I think. But I don't know that we're closer than we were then, but I think we want to be. And I think those discussions are happening. There's a reason why you're seeing coalitions come together of really unlikely bedfellows who are coming together to work on an issue that in the past they would have fought on. It's so much sexier to have the Republicans and the Democrats fight with one another than it is to have them get along. And especially in an election year, we all line up behind our side and we pick up our swords and our guns and our bows and arrows and we aim them at the other side because we're going to inflict the maximum amount of damage. But over the 10 years that I've been with the Christian Coalition, I've gotten inside enough to see how the sausage is made. And as you get in the inside of what goes on within our government at the federal level, at the state level, even at the local level, you start to find that the people you see fighting on TV sit down and have coffee the next morning together, and they work things out. And there's great solutions that come out of it because there are a lot of people who just really want good things for our community, but we have differing ideas of how we get there. And so if we can start with a desire for a common outcome, and then we can hash through the ideas we have. Even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So even people who we disagree with on millions of things are going to sometimes have a good idea. And so when we pull people together and we get a community of people who want good things for their community, who have decent hearts and are decent people, we can come up with really great solutions. And I think that even 5 years ago, if we had tried to host this event here tonight, we could have done it in one of the closets over there because of the people who would have been paying attention. And instead, here we are tonight in a room with all of you here to want to be part of this process, to want to add to the solution and not be part of the problem. And so to answer your question, Dave, I don't think that we are closer, but I think we want to be.
Nice answer. Democracy, what it looks like today is probably nowhere near what the drafters envisioned. Democracy was meaningful debate, but it was respectful. The aisle, in and of itself, when you get into the Capitol, in state and federal government, is the divide to begin with. They should have let people sit together so that they got to know each other. They should have let ideas flow, not from the leaders that are within the Capitol, but from those that bring those ideas to the floor. And not everything gets to the floor because somebody's agenda doesn't want it to go to the floor. So the learningful, meaningful document of the framers is being silenced because people don't let people speak. And the whole purpose of our government was to allow meaningful dialogue to come to a compromise, no matter how they had to get there, that works in the best interests of us, the people, not for others that are driving these agendas. that document had a lot of great ideas. They're just not realizing how great those ideas are today.
Last word.
I mean, imagine knowing or finding out that a vision that you had was something that people were still striving for a couple hundred years later. That's an incredible accomplishment. And so I don't think that we should be disappointed in ourselves that we haven't yet achieved it, because personally, if I were one of those founding fathers and I found out that all of you were still striving for a vision all of this time later, I would be rather proud of that, to be honest. And so I think the engagement and the dialogue is really important. There are threats to it, and we have to be aware of that, but I think that engagement is really important. And earlier, Pete described the justice system and how we go, during his career around as a Ferris wheel. Another way that it is often described is as a pendulum. And I've seen even in the last few weeks a lot of news stories out there that say, oh, the pendulum's swinging back to tough on crime. The pendulum is swinging back to the right. It's swinging back to the conservative side. But then they give examples like Oregon reversing their policy on drugs now. I don't personally know what's conservative about sitting around wasting time dithering on exactly how we criminalize or don't criminalize drugs. I personally think that what is conservative is getting people clean so that they can get back to work and be productive members of society.
Amen.
Or they give the example of sending the National Guard into the subways to police them because there's so much crime. I personally don't know what is conservative or what's right or what that means about the pendulum swinging back to the Republican side, that we're sending our National Guard into the subways. I think personally what I see as conservative is properly funding and overseeing law enforcement so that they can do their job. And so I think these are the discussions that the Founding Fathers probably did think. Did they imagine that we were going to be having them on X or Twitter or whatever you're calling it these days, or that we were going to have elected officials who were constantly campaigning instead of governing? No, they probably didn't see it going that way. But engaging in the conversation and really defining what it means to us to be conservative, while our friends on the left define what it means to them to be progressive, is living up to the Founding Fathers.
Turn it over to Tara for some concluding remarks.
Please thank these highly intelligent, wonderful people that have provided such great thoughts this evening. There's still dessert left. Please do not leave it here. Continue the conversation. We still have a little bit of time that we can be here together tonight, sharing thoughts and ideas, cheering each other on. Grab some dessert, have some conversations. Our panelists are often very generous with their time and answering questions that we may not have been able to get to this evening. And of course, join us on Facebook to continue the conversation as well and keep up to date on other upcoming events. Thank you so much for being here this evening.